Hey kids, it's Papa. Are you ready to explore the Bible? All right. Turn with me back to 1 Samuel chapter 14. 1 Samuel chapter 14. Now, remember, God was fighting a great battle for Israel. But Saul was confused. He didn't know what was going on. And then he tried to look spiritual and ask for advice from God. But then he didn't do it. And then as he's going into battle and chasing the enemy, he goes, and I want you to see once again in verse 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on mine enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. Now, you know what happens if you don't eat food? You get weak, you get wobbly. Yeah. And that's one of the things about dieting is that, sometimes you just run out of energy and you can't do things. You can't think right. You tire easily. And so here's all of these men who are suddenly said, let's go into battle. They grab their sword, they go into battle. And they're getting tired, and they're running, and they're fighting, and they're exhausted, and they're not getting any food because Saul told. See, normally a soldier would be running along, and he'd reach back into his backpack, he'd pull out some bread and some cheese, and he'd eat it as he was running, and the soldiers would constantly be refueling. Your father, ask him about this. When he runs, he eats something. But on these long runs where he burns so many calories, he's got to eat something along the way. And they didn't, and they were getting weak. And so they're fighting. Well, Jonathan and his armor bearer weren't with them, but they saw what was going on, and they entered into the battle too, and they're chasing and they're running along. And I want you to see in verse 25, and they were all of the land came to a wood, and there was honey on the ground. Okay, apparently a beehive, and the honey was there. And verse 26, and when the people were coming to the wood, behold, the honey dropped, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. They feared what Saul had said. But Jonathan heard not what his father charged the people with the oath. Therefore he put forth the end of his rod that was in his hand, and he dipped it in the honeycomb, and he put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened, because honey will do that for you. Honey is great. It gives you pretty close to instant energy. And then answered one of the people and said, Thy father straightly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food this day. And the people were faint. And Jonathan said, My father hath troubled the land. I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more if happily the people had eaten freely this day of the spoils of their enemies which they found, and had not been now much even a greater slaughter amongst the Philistines. And so they're fighting, but because the soldiers were running out of energy, the battle quit too soon, and they weren't able to completely destroy the enemy. They smote the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. And the people flew upon the spoil, and they took sheep and oxen and calves, and they slew them upon the ground, and the people did eat with the blood. In other words, when the sun went down, it actually comes to the end of the day, because the Israelites' day ends at 6 o'clock. And so at 6 o'clock, they realized they were no longer under the curse that Saul had put out there. And so they grabbed some sheep and some oxen. They were starving, and they killed them. And rather than hanging them up to drain out all the blood properly, okay, the way the Jewish law said they should have, instead, they went and they ate it too soon. And so Saul, notice verse 35, built an altar unto the Lord and came. It was first they built unto the Lord, and Saul said, Let us go down to the Philistines by night and spoil them until the morning, and let us not leave a man of them. And so, he said, let's do that. And then they said, well, maybe we ought to ask God about that, because we're pretty tired. And so they went and they asked the Lord, but he wouldn't answer. And Saul said, why won't the Lord answer? He's still not answering. And so they said, well, what's the problem? And they realized that somebody had eaten something. Somebody had violated the curse, and God wasn't going to answer if, the army was under the curse. And so Saul said, "Well, we've got to find out who did the wrong thing. So, all right, let's put all of the army, and we'll put Jonathan and me over here, and we'll see. Maybe it's the leadership, or maybe it's you." And so they cast lots, and the lot fell against Saul and Jonathan. And Saul said, "You and I? And so they said, "Let's cast lots between the two of us." And so they did. And it turns out that it was Jonathan. And Saul said, "Jonathan, what have you done?" And Jonathan said, "Well, okay, you went and made that curse on us, but I didn't know about it." So in verse 43, Jonathan told him, "I said, I but tasted a little bit of honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and lo, I must die." And Saul answered, God do so and more also, if thou shalt not surely die, Jonathan." And so Saul is going to kill his own son, Jonathan. But the people stepped up and said, "No, no, no." Notice verse 45. And the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. Okay? So all of this stupidity on Saul's part caused Israel to not be able to have a complete battle and to have a complete victory. Let me ask you, does God want us to have partial victories, or does God want us to have complete victories? And I'm here to tell you, God wants us to have complete victories. The problem is that we won't let him. And we're always doing compromises. And we're always saying, "Well, Lord, I'll serve you this way if you let me have this sin." Or "Lord, I'll go, you want me to do this? Okay, I'll go halfway, but I won't go all the way." And God wants us to have complete victories. The problem is that many times we are not willing to let him do that because we don't trust him, or we don't believe him, or we don't want to do what he wants us to do. God wants us to have complete victories. But the problem is us. We won't let him. So, question is, are you going to let him? Are you going to have complete victories for God? And if you're going to, you have to obey him completely. Okay? Hey, love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.